I think about my own journey. It was all principles based that got me to make the transition to multiplication, and the burning in my heart that the principles created was what had me ready to get the tools when they were handed to me, because I was failing so much at trying to get the principles done that whenever I started to get some simple tools that actually could put into practice what my heart wanted to do, I was ready for those practices. Without the principles, I would have never been ready for those practices.
Josh said something. He said it a couple different times. He says, we cannot expect that something that's been crock potted in us can be microwaved in someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where we discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. Dave Miller and Mark Gearing are here today with Bryan King, who happens to be a fan of the University of Oklahoma Sooners. And so we're going to talk something other than football, because this is a terrible, terrible, terrible football season for you guys. Go Pokes. How's that for an intro, Bryan King?
I love it. I don't know about that. I didn't know that was coming, Dave Miller. So, yeah.
People who are outside of Oklahoma are like, we don't even care. Mark doesn't even care. But I just want you to know I care. And I wanted it on recording.
Well, I want you to know that I root for the Oklahoma State Cowboys when they're not playing the Oklahoma Sooners. So,
and I want you to know that I root for Oklahoma State Cowboys and anyone who plays against OU. Just saying.
You did not have to tell me this, so I already knew it.
So now we're actually going to get to the podcast stuff that Mark actually cares about.
It's going great places.
Absolutely. For reals, though, you guys have put together some pretty good resources for legacy churches, especially training on how to get to movement and multiplication inside of legacy churches. So you guys labeled it Ignite. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So, man, it's fun to be on with you guys. I might be questioning just a little bit after that intro, but I am glad to be on here today. And
you should be questioned if you're such an OU fan, but that's all right. Go ahead.
Exactly right. So, but Ignite. We have some friends that live in South Asia, and they're connected to a ministry called Central India Christian Mission, and it happens to be kind of the brand of churches that I come out of. That a lot of our churches, they support this ministry. And a handful of, I guess about a decade ago, they began to read Yin Kai stuff, began to read other movement stuff, began to get a little bit of training. And they just essentially trained some of their pastors to, begin to multiply. And so over the last 5 years, they've just been seeing lots of fruit. And then in COVID, they saw a ton of fruit. And the cool thing is, my friend Josh Howard, who's a part of that ministry, he just gets a lot of requests from churches in the US, in the West, like, what are you guys doing? And so I had an opportunity to meet Josh about 1.5 years ago. And he's just a very gifted vision caster. And I was just like, man, we need to work together, and really to the traditional church, like helping them understand what this stuff is. And as he shared, it was like, this seems like the Bible, like, and you can see guys leaning in and listening, like, this sounds like the book of Acts, this sounds like the Gospels. And so this idea, and in South Asia, they call their church planting ministry Ignite. But this idea, it's what would it look like to walk alongside traditional pastors who they're learning about this stuff, they're hearing about it, and maybe they're not ready just to go full-fledged into it, but they want a season of understanding more of what movements are about. And so this idea was born with a handful of us, just to say, how could we actually walk with pastors through a season to expose them to movement principles, and then really on the backside to help them craft a plan to move their church more in this direction of multiplying disciples and churches, if the Lord opens that door for them. So that's kind of the nutshell of this whole idea, and how we kind of move forward with how could we bless these churches and walk alongside them.
Man, that's awesome. And Bryan, I know you've been doing this in the legacy church environment for years, and so you get it more than most. What those kind of folks would be approaching Josh and you and others about. How would you kind of summarize up like the difference between what pastors, like the pathway maybe is the way I would summarize it up. What would you say the pathway looks like that's different for pastors versus other people that might be vision cast to you?
Yeah, I don't know if it's in fact it's nothing different what we showed, what we exposed them to and we walked them through. There are some tweaks that we did along the ways that maybe a traditional training where we might introduce biblical principles, but I think more than anything it's really and like you said, just living in the trench of walking with people here in our context, and just knowing the questions they ask, knowing the presuppositions that they have, and also understanding that the typical pastor, like, he has a lot on his plate. He wants to reach his community. He loves his church. He loves the people who are in his church. He wants to see them grow deep in Jesus. He wants to see his church succeed. And then, you got all the shepherding stuff. You have all kinds of fires that you're putting out all the time. And so how can we help these guys be exposed to this without coming in and saying, we have a plan for you. We want to help you, and we want to serve you, and we want to expose you, to the biblical principles. So I'll give you an example. And where we really start off with is God's vision. What's God's vision from Genesis to Revelation? Not much different. If you're a movement practitioner, not much different than what you might get in a residency or an intensive of understanding God's heart for the world and how we can be involved in that. We started there, but then we quickly went to the biblical pathway. What do we see Jesus doing? What do we see the apostles doing? And we just did something really simple like this. Open up your Bibles. We're going to open up our Bibles today, and we're going to read through the Mark chapter 1, and we want you to identify, what do you see Jesus doing? And so as they did that, like, they were finding the same patterns that we would see. Sometimes we might lay out a paradigm ahead of time and say, here's a helpful paradigm to understand what Jesus was doing. We kind of push that to the side, like the four fields or some other paradigm. And we just said, let's see, and you guys tell us what you see Jesus doing.
Wow. Yeah.
And they came up with the same stuff, right? So,
yeah. That's awesome. So really facilitating the discovery piece helped them to get, has helped them, sounds like, to get more of a picture of what you're inviting them into from there to get back to that biblical picture.
Right. Yeah. And I think I actually had a conversation with a young pastor this last week, and he approached me and he basically said, and he's not in the cohort, but at an event I was at, he said, I've done some of this stuff and I haven't seen it work. I've trained the 411. I've gone out in the harvest. I've even done a discovery Bible study.
Yeah.
And I just haven't seen it work. And I think for a time I was there, like, and I know you guys have been there, like, this doesn't seem to be working. And so what I told him was, I gave him some examples of where I had seen it work. Is that he said, have you seen it work? So I told him, let me tell you a couple examples. But I said, what this is really about is, are we going to model our lives after Jesus and what he did and who he was, and even, if I dare say, his methods? And so I think a lot of pastors, they live in that world where you have, here's this sermon series, here's this evangelism book, here's this and that, and we're looking for that thing that works.
Right.
And so recentering ourselves on the biblical framework is so key. And to begin to think through, how can we help our people look like Jesus, right? And live out their ministries like Jesus lived out their ministries. And so I think that was probably the most critical piece that we did together. But I think the way we did it, we didn't come in and say, we have this plan for you. In fact, Mark, we introduced several different movement paradigms. So we might use the 4 fields, but we introduced other paradigms for them to see how they might be able to construct or borrow still, one of these paradigms and incorporate that in the life of their church.
So it sounds like, Bryan, you really focused on helping them discover the principles as the first piece. And then from there, things kind of flowed into methods. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, totally. And we spent a lot of time on that. In fact, we interviewed both of you guys on this reproducible path. And so that's one of the things we did was we had a series of podcasts. And so that would go along with every week on these different subjects, big vision, the biblical pathway. And that was one of those of lost a leader. How do you take someone and help them on that pathway? And how do you train people? How do you walk alongside them and help other people, move in that pathway? And so that really setting that framework, really helped move us forward. And then you can begin to talk through some of the tactical things of how are you going to go out living this out. So definitely.
You mentioned the cohort a couple of times. What's the structure of this look like for guys who get involved?
That's a great question. Yeah. So the current structure is we have podcasts, different readings, different studies, things like the 4 fields discovery, where we might lay that framework, where we see, Jesus entering into new fields, sharing the gospel, making disciples church. If you're not familiar with that, laying that over, a passage or like the first journey, Acts 13 and 14. So they'd have studies like that. They would listen to the podcast, not a ton, but you can get it done, throughout the week. And then every other week we were getting together on Zoom and essentially debriefing that content. And then we would also, introduce, another module, another piece. At one point, like we had Ray Moran on from Kansas City. He came on and he talked to us about like a circle of influence around our church buildings. And like, could we own that, And so they would do that, and we would structure that time frame, those bi-weekly calls. There would be 90 minutes, and then we would structure in 3/3. So the first third would be looking back, at the work that they had done together as a team, because the vast majority of people on the cohort, they were together as a team. So we want you to do this work together. So let's debrief what you've been learning, look at something new that's associated with the same subject, and then what's your plan moving forward. And then again, that off week, we want to encourage you guys to get together and to do this work together. So, and really the guys who were able to mark off that time, they're the guys who excelled, like the guys who spent time together processing this information and coming back to the table. They're the ones who really made a lot of progress.
Yeah, I listened to the rest of those podcasts just because I wanted to listen to them. And honestly, I don't think that there was one podcast that I went through that I didn't text you something about some gold nugget that came out of that. Like, just content wise, in terms of podcasts, there's just some great little pieces. I don't think any of the podcasts are just going to cause somebody's whole world to get upended and rocked, but every single one of them are going to give you something that's going to help you just take that next step forward. And I think this pattern that you guys put together, as far as from where start to stop and moving people through the process, has been, laid out really, really well for the ones who have completed it. Cause you guys have done a cohort, right? For the ones who have completed it, what's some of the feedback that you've gotten that's been like the aha moments or the ways in which this has really impacted the way they think about ministry and reproduction and multiplication? Yeah.
So I think especially the guys really enjoyed being with people who have some experience of living it out. Like they wanted to hear from us. And quite frankly, like I share this with these other guys, and I've shared it with you guys. Like, it's super messy and it's not clean, like in this context of where I sit. It ebbs and flows, and sometimes it's like, what are we even doing? Yeah. But the fact that we're in the trench, like, it speaks a lot to these guys, and it helps them know that they can do it. It gives them confidence. So I think that was super valuable to them, and everybody on the call, has had experience either in traditional churches or walking, alongside traditional churches. So I think that was helpful. And then the other thing was they really loved being together with peers.
Yeah.
And they just loved, soaking up. And honestly, a lot of the time, like I'm learning stuff, Dave, as I'm writing stuff down, listening to them, because
Sure.
it was awesome. In fact, this last weekend we went to Springfield, Missouri, one of the churches that was in the cohort. We did a gospel conversations training with them. And I'm like their service, I'm just like blown away at how they're incorporating the principles of this stuff into their service. And not, like you said, Dave, they're not just plowing the thing over. They pulled a guy up and they gave a case study of a guy who took salsa to his neighbors after using the Pray for Every Home app. And he like got out of his chair at home. And so like they're just like, again, they're taking the principles where in the past, I know in the past, some of our experience where we would find the guy who went and shared the gospel, we would find the guy who led someone to Christ, and they're taking the principles of attempts. They're taking the principles of leading indicators of, getting to know people, sharing the gospel, and they're celebrating that. And so
Cool.
Anyway, cool stuff. I'm just like, this is awesome. I wish I had the opportunity to go through something like this. And I wish our leaders here had the opportunity to go through something like that. And I think, Mark, it goes back to, they knew the principles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's good.
I was going to say one thing real quick, Mark, is I just really appreciate, Bryan, the way that you guys are pulling all the stuff together. Because if there's anybody who's failed fast and fell forward, has been you. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense at all, in the sense that I've just watched you continue to just learn and learn and learn and learn, even with a lot of guys that are looking up to you because of what's happened there at Cedar Ridge and what God's been able to use you guys for. Just repackaging this and learning and taking all of those learnings and then pushing them to other people so that they're, your ceiling becomes their floor, is just really inspiring. I really appreciate the way you guys are doing that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's like, I think it's so helpful, the community of practices, which something else we talk about in there, and we're modeling the community of practice is able to, and Mark, you and Dave have both been a part of that, to look in and say, keep going, it's valuable. And so I think same thing for these guys, Jared and Josh and Russ, just to say, hey, this is valuable. What you have to say is valuable. And so that's modeling for these guys too, because you begin to like, okay, we did the training and now what? Like, is anybody going to do anything? Right. And so like, no, we just got to keep going. We got to keep casting the vision. We got to keep walking alongside people. And the guy went to go sell or, take the salsa, man, that if we get a bunch of people start doing little stuff like that,
Bingo.
then build on each other. Right.
That's good. Yeah. I was going to ask you, Bryan, I think, when I was thinking about recording this today and just learning about what you're doing, the thought came to my mind to just kind of wonder what audience we're even speaking to as we're jumping on this kind of podcast, because there are those that may hear this podcast, or those that have been practicing in the US or around the world, that as we talk about that growth curve of adoption, they may be early adopters that are more just trying to catalyze and get things started, and have had interactions with churches. And then there's also the audience of those that you're targeting, those that are working and leading within these churches. And some of them you're even highlighting, hey, I've tried some of this and it didn't really work. So tell me, has this worked for you? Maybe I would love if you could speak to those different audiences and however you want, but just speak to what is it that you're seeing that's different about this, that even just as you put into practice so far, that you think could be really effective in speaking to that early adopter, but also maybe to that pastor that might be interested?
That's right. That's so good. I think, in fact, I was standing with a mutual friend of ours, Kyle Pearson, last year sometime, and another brother in Dallas. And we were just like, as we look around in our circles, in my circle, their circles, there are a ton of people who are out of the traditional church. And we can't give. And so the point was, we can't give up on her. And So I maintain in every church, there are people across America that want to multiply disciples in churches. They just haven't been given the vision and they don't know how.
Yeah.
So for the practitioner, right, the early adopter, I just want to make a case that the traditional church is a sleeping giant. It may be the sleeping giant. And so let's not give up on her, right? And so so pray for her, right? Continue to cast a vision for her. And what I would say is, if you have someone in your life who may fit in that category of a traditional pastor, traditional elder, something like that, this potentially could be a pathway forward to help expose them. And I'll just repeat it again. We're not coming in and telling them what to do. Now, here's the thing that may get frustrating for some people. When we go down this road, because one of the things we do is we want you to create your pathway for your church. We want you to create or still one, or use the one that because we did hold up 4 fields, like, hey, this is the one we use. When we went through tools, we said that these are the tools we use. But we got to realize that if we take them through these principles and they choose a pathway or they choose tools that we may not view them as movement tools, are we okay with serving the church and helping her fulfill her vision that God's given her, right? So, man, I think that's a real gut check for us as practitioners. Like, do we really love the church, and are we willing to swing the bat and miss, and potentially even just help them fulfill the vision that God's given them, even if it doesn't get them to where we think they need to be? If that makes sense. So, and again, I think maybe even just adjusting some language when we're talking with traditional churches and saying, I mean, it doesn't have to be through the cohort, but just like, how could we get some people praying for their neighborhood? And we know that if people would pray for their neighborhoods, God's going to continue to walk them, down that. But at the same time, if they're praying for their neighborhood, they're going next door, maybe the church will grow, which the church leaders, they seem to be focused on. But are we okay with that? So anyway, I would just talk to that practitioner and say, man, let's check our hearts and let's really serve the church. Don't stop what you're doing. I mean, if God's leading you towards a segment, to a people group, go do it, right? But maybe in that segment, how could we bring other people along in that way? So then the other thing, just talking to pastors, I would be like, because I have sat across from elders and staff members in my own church, and they do not understand. They have not understood what we're doing. And what I saw through this, I mean, they think we're out there just sharing 3 circles with everyone and baptizing them. That's what some people think. And then we're starting these willy-nilly house churches. So as the pastor, I would just say, won't you give a chance to actually look at the biblical principles and just start there, right?
Yeah.
And then let that inform the tools and the methods and things like that. And actually you might be able to speak back into us and critique the work we're doing, but it comes from those principles that we get from God's word. So that'd be my 2 thoughts there.
So what are a couple of ways that you've seen, you mentioned the salsa as an example. What are a couple of ways that you've seen these principles work themselves out in a way that could be very similar to some of the tools that we're already using, or maybe some things like the salsa that's super dissimilar, but you're seeing the principles enacted in just a different method or different kind of tool way of doing things, practical handle?
Well, let me underline that salsa story, because that's where we failed here. And I say we failed, maybe that's a strong word, but we didn't celebrate that stuff enough. So I want to underline that one. That's awesome. And I told Wayne, the pastor, I'm like, you're doing such a great job at casting vision. Like, just keep telling stories of your people doing stuff like that. Like, that will feed. So that's one. And then the other one, I'm thinking of a brother up in Iowa, small church. He's on the cohort by himself. And when we came to the kingdom plan, his plan was to begin, I think it was maybe once a month, to try to get his small church, people from his small church, out in their small town prayer walking. And I don't even know if they were going to be knocking on the door. I think it was just we want to pray for our town.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. So, and then to begin to measure that, like this is how many hours and how many people are doing that, right? And the other thing was, he's like, I want to, our metric, I want to see that like how many people know how to share the gospel, and then how many people know that they can baptize, and how many can baptize. And I think he even said, how many people over the next 5 years could we say had baptized? So this just be a couple things where there's, again, informed by the principles from the Bible, of taking, old scorecards, if you will, and transforming those to, kingdom oriented scorecards.
It's fun to listen to the way that they're, meeting their congregations. Because one of the things we talk about all the time is that if you just take the tools and you go, okay, I'm going to put this tool and slam it into every context, it's just not going to work, because the tools are built out of a certain context. In the same way, I think if we don't let pastors understand that we're on board with them in the context that they're working with, which happens to be believers who are following Jesus and need to learn these simple steps, I think we're going to be self-defeating. I love the fact that these guys are adapting just these principles to the context that they're in, knowing that eventually, as they're pushing their people out into the harvest, that they're going to also begin to have the ability to then adapt their principles to those things that are happening, in the harvest outside of the church as their people engage. Because if they can contextualize the principle in their own church, then they'll be able to contextualize it better outside the church well.
That's right. And I think that, even in the 6-7 months of figuring out or understanding those principles, beginning to live them out. And that was the other thing too, I would say half of the guys, we would hear, maybe more than half, they would tell us stories of putting someone, going on a prayer walk. They got to share with someone, just stuff like that. And maybe it was the first time in their life. But then you put those people in the room and they began to, because they become the experts in their context and they can help each other. Where, I would just say, like, for me, compared, I'll just use Wayne as an example. I'm not a senior pastor. I have no idea what that's like. I've never been a senior pastor. So I can talk to him, and, the dry cleaning guy can talk to him, but when he has a peer and they're learning this stuff, right, and they can, like you're saying, learning from the word on what did Jesus do, they can begin to flesh that out more, rather than, like you said, here, just go do this. Which let me be clear. We're saying we're not telling them what to do. We do think that is a helpful thing to help people and say, here's the next step. So no one listen to this and say we're not in favor of that. So, but I do think with pastors, and maybe there's a whole, population of the church as well, that actually there is, as I think about it, that if we tell them what to do, they're going to say, see you later. So exactly.
Whenever I was a pastor, if somebody came in and started telling me you need to do this, this, and this, I'd have been like, see you later. Right. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, and it makes sense from what you're saying, Bryan. If I just reflected back to you, maybe I'm reducing it too much, but this idea of like we're the head, heart, hands, and multiplying church that we're talking about in this podcast. And most of the time in the circles we run in and the way that we kind of filter is we start with that hands piece and like, who's going to put this into practice? Who's going to be the doers? But what the average pastor, they've got like this hands piece coming across their desk every 5 minutes, a new curriculum, a new thing. And so what you're doing, if I had to reflect back, is like you're taking them into the heart and the head. You're taking them to this place of, let's go back to what did Jesus do, and how does that hit your heart? How do you process that? What do you need to do out of that? And then the hands piece becomes something that's coming from them rather than from the outside.
Totally.
The two, whenever I jump in on that one too, Mark, I think about my own journey. It was all principles based that got me to make the transition to multiplication, and the burning in my heart that the principles created was what had me ready to get the tools when they were handed to me, because I was failing so much at trying to get the principles done that whenever I started to get some simple tools that actually could put into practice what my heart wanted to do, I was ready for those practices. Without the principles, I would have never been ready for those practices.
Wow.
That's good. Josh said something. He said it a couple different times. He says, we cannot expect that something that's been crock potted in us can be microwaved in someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good word.
And so my journey is different than yours, Dave, because I'm not as smart as you. But I think these principles, I learned them over the years. intuitively. And I just knew that I was missing something. So when Dave Miller and Troy Cooper showed up at Cedar Ridge in 2015 and got on a board and put a few little tools on the board, I was like, that's what I've been looking for. So, but I do think in retrospect, like we probably ran around telling people about the tools way too much rather than, let's figure out how we can crockpot this vision in people's hearts. And so, and then you create the why, then they can say, how do I do it? Right. And so, in fact, I'll say this, Wayne, Northside Christian Church in Springfield, Missouri, that we had gone through the journeys, we had gone through the lost a leader, and these guys are chomping. They're 3 guys on staff. They're chomping at the bit. The next call, they come in and they're just like they're talking over the rest of the group, not in a bad way, but they're like, this is amazing. Is there anyone that's actually doing this stuff in North America? We want to know how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
That was the moment I'm like, we're onto something right now, because their hearts are primed. Now we can begin to help them. And now they're
now they're ready for the tools. Yeah.
Just tell us what to do. Right.
Because their hearts are ready for it.
Yep.
Yeah.
What I'm realizing just as we're on this podcast, it's fun to like be processing this in real time with you guys, but that's the freshman syndrome thing that Dave always talks about, that we come in as the seniors and we don't remember where we were when we started. But I resonate with that too. I mean, I think when I started to process all of this, it wasn't because I saw a tool. It was because I was going back to the word and things weren't quite all making sense and quite lining up. And I was feeling provoked in my heart to something more. And then the hands piece, the methods piece came along at the right time and it ignited me. So it sounds like what you guys are doing really is just helping people take the whole journey rather than just finding those that are ready for the methods piece.
And realizing that there probably will be people on the way who they benefit from it, but there may not be. I mean, I was thinking of one guy who basically said, I think our target is going to be the homeless in our small town. And I'm like, then I was like, no, that's wrong. Like my attitude is really bad, because Jesus is speaking to him and his church, and I got to get out of the way of that. And so, and it made me remember, as I was thinking about that a minute ago, to when I really started out here in Sapulpa on the west side of Tulsa as a pastor. I would go down to this mobile home park and I would just walk and I would pray. I didn't know how to share the gospel. I didn't know how to make a disciple. I just knew that I wanted to reach those people in that mobile home park. And God was faithful, right? Like he's given me everything I need: tools, strategy, friends, to be able to reach places like that. And so, like, my goodness, like I just need to be rebuked, because I think, I have the answers and I don't. And so the word of God, introduce them to that, and then, it will take care of the rest.
So if somebody's listening to this and they go, man, how do I get involved in something like this cohort? Where do I get connected? What do I do? How do I get information? Their just hearts get stirred by this. What do they need to do?
Yeah, we have a link, and we'll have to drop it in the, we'll have to drop it somewhere. We have a link.
Mark can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, you put in the show notes, and you can also you can email me, bking@cedarridgecc.com, and I'll jump on a call with you. The team will jump on a call with you. There is a fee to jump into it, and I don't remember what it is. I think it's like $500, $600 for the team. All that money goes to church planting in India. And so, but we're asking, this is another thing, just thinking through church staffs, we want them to be bought in. And so far that's been a helpful thing, that, they're having to pay to get into it. And so they stay with us for a while. So yeah.
Perfect. It's called Ignite right now. The
Ignite Multiplication Cohorts. That's right.
And is it cool if Mark drops that little infographic that you guys, it kind of shows a little bit of the pathway that you guys are taking?
Definitely. That'd be great.
Yeah. I appreciate the work you guys are doing. Bryan is only about an hour and a half down the road from Oklahoma City. He's probably been one of the closest brothers in terms of the work with me. It's been a joy. We would meet occasionally as much as we could, which is never enough. But McDonald's halfway down the turnpike.
That's right. That's
over a Big Mac or a sausage McMuffin. It was an amazing meeting place.
Pretty much when I wanted to quit and Dave wanted to quit, we would just meet at the turnpike man,
tell each other, don't quit. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. We'd whine and cry to each other. And then the other one would be like, don't be stupid. Keep going. Okay.
Right. Well, thank you guys. It's been, man, awesome to hang out today, and love you both. And so thankful for you both. Learn a ton from you, and hopefully this is helpful for some, brothers and sisters as we all continue to, walk this road together.